Good morning. My name is Cindy Stewart. I am your instructor for today. The class that you're taking is session 2 of our continuity of operations for nonprofits session. This session will run from 10 to about noon. For those of you that hopefully will get out a little bit early, and I will give you the grace of a few minutes at the end if we can. Some housekeeping. If you are speaking, please put on your visual as well as your audio, so that folks that are wanting to read lips could do so. That would be helpful. Marcia Hovey, who is the executive director of Cadre, she is also our access coordinator for today. Marcia will be helping the ASL folks as well as anyone else who has access needs for this presentation. Our presentation will be posted on our website. Give us a day or so to gather all of that information and get it up on the website, but you'll be able to see this video as well as all of the backup information that we provide throughout this session. Okay. This is going to be an interactive session, so please don't be shy. Feel free to jump in if you've got questions, if you've got comments. I would love to hear some of your experiences as it pertains to this topic as well, so that we don't have to listen just to me talk the whole day. All right, here we go. Okay. Objectives for today's class. We're going to do a little bit deeper dive into essential functions. We're going to talk a little bit about what you may have done or may not have had time to do over this past week for your homework. We're going to determine what resources we need for those functions, how we're going to get those things done. And then we're going to explore a few scenarios, like what happens if the boss is in Tahiti? The boss is always in Tahiti, so come on. You know, a building and the boss is in Tahiti, or what if we only have 30% of our staff and the boss is in Tahiti? I mean, you know, how are we going to get these essential functions accomplished? Okay, so we'll talk about some of those things. Okay. Excuse me. I want you to keep some concepts in mind. First of all, this is not an emergency response plan. COOP has very little to do with what the disaster is. COOP doesn't really care what the disaster is. COOP's primary focus is to keep the boat afloat, to keep those essential functions going so that the people that are responding to the disaster can do their responding and the organization can keep their essential functions up and running. Okay, the timeline of a COOP, typically getting those essential functions up and running or keeping them up and running, getting them up and running within the first 12 hours of bang, whatever bang is, and then keeping them up and running for 30 days until the disaster is over, until the manager says, we've got another plan, let's move to that. So it's that interim plan, that just keeps the boat afloat until we can make some other decisions. Okay. I'm just going to do a quick refresher of the elements of COOP. For those of you that were with us last week, this is a rerun. Okay. COOP is based all around those essential functions, those things that you have to get done no matter what. Okay. Who's going to do those things? That's the delegation of authority, the orders of succession, and your human capital management. And we'll dive into some of these things a little bit later. What resources are you going to need to keep those essential functions going? You need a new facility. You need an alternate means of communicating. What about your vital records and maybe your vendors even? Do you need those things? What kind of resources do you need? And then kind of those wraparound procedures. What if we can't do it at all? What if we have to give it over to someone else to do? who are we going to give it over to? And once the disaster's called and everything is clear, what are we going to do to reconstitute this thing? How are we going to get those files back into the system that we've been using day to day? How are we going to bring our staff back? How are we going to move back into our building? Or how are we going to get back to our normal day-to-day or whatever the new normal might be? And then, of course, we have to test, train, and exercise. Always, always, always test, train, and exercise. Every plan we have. Okay, so let's take just a little bit deeper dive into essential functions. And I want to, at this point, share with you the workbook that, oh, and I did this wrong. I'm sorry. I have to unshare and then reshare. My apologies. Let me share my screen instead so that I can switch back and forth. Okay. Essential functions. This is the workbook that you were given last week. If you did not get the workbook, I will get you one again this week. I will email out to everyone that's in this class. Okay. The workbook is the meat of your continuity of operations plan. If you complete your workbook, you almost have a COOP plan. Okay, we're going to start with all the functions that you have done, that your agency does on a day-to-day basis, all of your functions. So not just the essential ones, we'll weed out the ones that are non-essential as we go through the process. Somebody give me an example of one of the functions that your agency does day-to-day.
This is Sherry. We do information and referral and assistance every day.
Sherry does information and referral assistance every day. So she would write that down. She would write down a brief description of that, and she would write down who the person was that was ultimately responsible for that function. That could be a whole team of people, but who's the person that we're going to turn to say, is this function still up and running? That's the staff person that we're going to talk to for this particular function. We'll go through and we'll write down every single function that our agency does. Could be a long list, right? Some of you do some really extensive things, but you'll find that this is going to be the best way to weed out which ones are essential. Okay. After you've done that, there is a next section, and all I did was clicked on the little plus sign at the top of my screen of my workbook. For those of you that are not familiar with how to use Excel, the workbook is split into, there's some hidden columns along the side. And these are questions that you might ask yourself about that particular line item or that particular function. So in the case of the payroll support, which is the bottom one here on the workbook that we have the example, oh gosh, my workbook keeps doing this and I apologize. Come on, get back over here.
Jeez.
Yeah, I just went to the very end and I don't know why it's doing. Heather told me to do something and I can't remember what it is. Heather, we'll have to talk about that later. Okay, so let's say supporting payroll is one of the functions, okay? And the brief description, that means time, entering time and the approval process and maybe the audits for the payroll and who's responsible for that. The HR manager is responsible for that. Okay, so does this meet or fulfill the agency's mission? That could be one of the questions that you would want to ask in this situation. This does indirectly meets the agency's mission because it keeps the people paid that are meeting the agency's mission, right? Does this protect life, property, or the environment? Not necessarily. Is it considered critical to the receivers of the service? I would say that your employees probably think it's critical that they get paychecks. So I would say yes in that situation. Does it provide essential services like water, power, or food to others? That could make it essential. Does it support another's essential functions, another department's essential functions, another agency's essential functions? Is it a supporting? There's a little blank tab there that you could write something in that was specific to your agency or to your organization and how they do functions. And then a really important one, is it required in the first 30 days? Yes, it might be extremely important, but it could be held off for a month or 6 weeks or whatever. If that's the case, then maybe we don't have to have it written as an essential function. When I go through this process with agencies, I usually just write yes or no in the boxes here so that we can kind of then sort things out and figure out which ones are essential and which ones are not. Okay. Going on, we look a little bit more at prioritizing those essential functions, those functions. How long could this function be disrupted without serious consequences? So that's a little bit of asking the same question, is it required in the first 30 days? How long could we do without this function? If it's more than 30 days, then maybe it's not essential. Will an emergency incident increase or decrease the needs for this function? Let's say it's providing some kind of food to our clients. We're probably going to need to increase that function in a disaster. There may be more people that we need to provide food for. Can this function be performed via telework? So that might help us understand how many square feet we might need in an alternate facility. If this function is something that can be performed in a telework or from home, and our staff have the capabilities of doing that, they've got their laptops, they've got their VPN, whatever they need, they can do that function from home, then maybe we don't need as big a facility. Maybe we don't need a facility at all. Maybe we can do all of our services from teleworking. That's a question that you'll have to ask your agency. And then what impact will the loss of this function have? If we can't do this, if we can't provide food, or if we can't get paychecks out, what's the loss? What's the damage? What's the risk? What's it gonna cost us if we can't get this done? Okay. And then our last little section has to do with some of understanding about resources. So taking into consideration that payroll thing again. Okay, we've got it down to an essential function. Can one person do payroll for the entire agency, or do we need 2 people or 3 people to do that? How many people will it actually take to keep this function afloat? What files or records or systems are we going to need to do that? And how will we access those during our disaster? What are the things that we'll need to do that? If we have to go to hard copy paychecks, do we have those in a position where we can actually get those paychecks written? And then what vendors are we going to need to accomplish this function? Do we need to have someone that brings in trucks of food for us to be able to distribute? What about our paper product people? What about packaging? Who are those vendors? And do we know whether or not those vendors are resilient? Have we talked to them about their continuity of operations plan? And if they're not, do we have a backup supplier? As far as space is concerned, how much space are we going to need? Do we need 2 desks, 3 desks, a full office, 500 square feet, 12 printers? I don't know. What do we need to accomplish these functions? And in some cases, they're going to be a little redundant, like a printer. We might need a printer for 10 different functions. We don't need 10 printers. Okay. What communications devices do we need on a daily basis? And so that we can ensure that we've got backup for those communications devices. once we get into the situation where we're actually activating our COOP. Okay, so that's just the first tab of our workbook. And that's going to help give us the ability to then sort those functions, all those functions that we have. You might not need, you might get through the first part of this workbook and think, you know, this is taking out the trash. It's probably not an essential function. And we probably don't need to ask how long this function could be disrupted, because it's pretty obvious we could put the trash right outside the door for 30 days or whatever. So, you know, you might not need to go through every single column with every single function. You might, as you go through the columns, start recognizing, no, this is not really an essential function. Or yeah, it is. Let's go on and see what kind of resources we might need for it. Anyone take a look at this worksheet over this past week? And do you have any questions, thoughts, concerns about that first tab? Anybody?
This is Bernadette from San Francisco. Actually, this is, I was trying to fill out those boxes, but this is more, I was thinking that this is really a group exercise. Not a group exercise, but a work. Because what I may think is essential is just within my small group. So, that's my first impression is like, this is a discussion, of agency, this discussion.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And thank you for bringing that up. And my other recommendation to you is once you get all of those functions written, whoever that responsible staff person is, get them involved in completing this workbook. So because they're the ones that are going to know most what that function does and the importance of that function. I would also tell you that being vigilant about writing down everything is critical, because as you write down all of the functions that your agency does, some of them may pop out and look that you didn't even think about, but you'll find as you go through the process that they're essential. And you don't want everything you do to be written down as essential.
Essential.
So when you get to the place where you've determined what your essential functions are, you might try and prioritize them and say, if I could only do 5 of them, what 5 would I do? What are those top tier? And then make them in tiers, and put them into your plan. The only ones you need to write in your plan are the ones that you've determined are essential. You don't have to write every single one into your plan, just the ones that are essential. And you might make them in tiers so that you have your tier 1 essential and your tier 2 essential. And I break those into, I want my agency to do their tier 1 for sure, and their tier 2 if they can. And if they can't, and we have to push those tier 2 essentials off, then they're not really as essential as you might think, right?
Cindy, Amy has her hand raised.
Hi, Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Someone in our group raised this good question, namely, if we are a huge entity providing behavioral health services and we have multiple clinics, so we have the administrative leadership level, and then we have these multiple clinics. In terms of this exercise and how we order the development of the COOPs, would it be best to start at that leadership level or to start at the level of the clinic?
Not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so I guess when you think, so if we're, huge organization that provides mental health services. And so we have the leadership team, the head of our organization. Like I think of there being the need to have a COOP plan at that level, at that administrative level. And then we were thinking as a group that then we would want to have these plans at the level of each clinic. So we have, you know, around the city, different clinics providing services. And so I'm just thinking about, do we prioritize the creation of a COOP at that, beginning with the level, that leadership administrative level? Or are we working at the same time or even beforehand at the level of the clinic, which falls under that administrative?
Okay, I'm interested. That's an interesting question. I would not prioritize my functions based on management versus the clinics. I wouldn't prioritize them like that. I would prioritize them based on what is your agency's mission, and what if your agency's mission is done in the clinics, then the clinics should be, they should all be done at the same time. They, you know, you have to have a management team, but the functions of the management team might not be as essential as the functions of the clinic.
Okay.
So there isn't a priority based on management versus the clinics. It's based more on what those actual functions are. And whether, you know, I mean, you also have to take into consideration that there needs to be someone who is actually responding to the disaster. Someone, if it's a large earthquake, has got to be in charge of the direct response to the disaster itself. Your functions are those functions that you do day to day anyway, and you want to keep doing. So there have to be some people left available to respond to the disaster as well, and to activate that emergency operations plan, which is the response to the disaster rather than the continuity of operations plan.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Good. All right. Any other questions? Anybody else? Raise your hand or just go ahead and say, speak up. Anybody run into issues with filling out all the functions? I essentially asked you just to do that blue section. The list of functions.
Cindy,
Yes, ma'am.
Cindy, this is Heather. I'm sorry, I need to interrupt really quickly. We are trying to locate the second interpreter. If the second interpreter cannot be located, we'll need to cut this meeting off at 1 hour. And at that point, just let people know that, you know, they can reach out with questions afterwards. But I wanted to make sure you as the instructor and that everyone else knew that we don't leave people behind. Just that was all. And hopefully we find someone, fingers crossed. I'll let you know.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right. So let's go on with who is going to do the functions. You figured out what the functions are. You've prioritized those functions. You have a little bit of information about what you might need, what kind of resources you might need, how much space you might need. And certainly feel free to take that workbook and massage it however you need to. The intention of the workbook is to get your juices flowing and get you thinking in the direction of essential functions and how to sort them out a little bit. As we talk about the who, the leg of who is going to do those functions, let's look a little bit at delegation of authority. I want to make sure that I stay that I stay close to an hour just in case we only have one interpreter. So I'm gonna kind of go a little bit faster until Heather has told me that we've got a second interpreter, and then we'll slow things down just a little bit. But if we are only going for an hour, we've only got 30 minutes left. So delegation of authority, who, when we talk about delegation of authority, and let me go back to the workbook just quickly, there is a tab for delegation of authority. We want to look not just at who, but who has the authority, but what type of authority do they have? So maybe the authority is the executive director is giving the authority to do a particular part of their task off to another person, to another position. And remember, we're always going to write our COOPs with titles, not necessarily names. Okay, so what is it that they're giving authority to? And what is the trigger or the condition that would trigger that delegation? When do they get that authority? And then what are the limitations of that delegation? They can do this, but they can't do this. So my example here says the executive director is giving the authority to dismiss non-essential staff with pay for the remainder of the day. And he's giving that authority over to the HR manager and to the department heads. Okay, what are the triggers? If the executive director is not able to be contacted, then those other positions have that authority. And what's the limitations for that authority? This delegation should only be used on the first day of the disaster, and only if the disaster is occurring for a small period of time, a short period of time. Okay, so those kind of things can help you to understand what your delegation of authority might look like. Okay, let's look a little bit at orders of succession. Now, in local government, we have orders of succession usually written into our emergency operations plan. The city manager, the director of finance, those kind of people. And if they're in Tahiti, who's going to do the job? Maybe there's an assistant. In your agency, it might be the executive director, and there might be an assistant executive director. If you have a small organization, it might be you and the other person that's in your office. The orders of succession should be written. If this person is not available, who is the next person to assume that responsibility? Your human capital management. Oh, and let me just look at the orders of succession. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Who is the key position? Who's the primary successor? And who's the secondary successor? And that gives you the opportunity to have two. Okay. You don't need to put titles. I mean, you don't need to put phone numbers or contact information. That stuff would all be kept separately. Human capital management, those are the people, the staff that are going to be performing those essential functions. So you don't have a tab in your workbook for human capital management because it is on your essential functions list on that column that says responsible staff. Okay, that's who your human capital management team is. Let's talk a little bit about the resources that we're going to need. Now, let's say we do need a facility. Where is that facility, and what kind of things are we going to need in that facility? So what is the alternate location? Our tab says, what is the alternate location? And we broke it into 2 alternate locations. So kind of like in an evacuation plan, you might have, for your family, you might have 2 evacuation spots. You might have the corner in case the disaster is small, maybe there's a fire in your house, and then you might have a larger, one that's for a larger, more extended incident. And the same thing holds true with your agency and an evacuation, and an alternate facility. You might have an option A, which is just a place where we're going to go for a few hours because the power's out in our building and we'll go back. Or you might have an option B, which is a larger, longer term event that might make it so that you need to stay there for an extended period of time. They might need to carve out office space for you in another location. So that becomes critical when you talk about the capacity of that facility. You know, you might be able to use, we do have our second interpreter here at this point, so we'll slow things down just a little bit.
Thank you. My apologies. I had the wrong Zoom number.
No worries. Thank you for being here. So the where was I? Let's see. The longer term facility that might give you you might have different facilities depending on the extent or the length of your disaster, right? So you might be able to go to a park building, for example, if your disaster is only for the rest of the day and they'll have the power up tomorrow, and you can use battery charged devices for a short period of time. So you might not need all of the facility that you would need if you were going to be there for a more extended period of time. You might be able to do without a VPN for 1 day or for 2 days, but you'll have to have it up and running after however, 5 or 6 days, whatever it is. So we have often done alternate facilities, 2 different ones, an option A and an option B, the shorter term and then the longer term. So in the example here, you want to put the address 123 Main Street. Wow, very ingenious. The address, potentially you'll want to have some directions to that or something a little bit more specific. How to access that facility during regular hours, and then again, how to access that facility after hours. Is there a facilities manager that you need to locate? Do they have a phone number? And you could actually write the phone number here so that if you were opening your COOP plan in the middle of the night and you went to the alternate facility, option B for a longer term facility, you'd have the facilities manager phone number right there. And then any special instructions that you might have. Come around to the back of the building. There's an alarm and the passcode is whatever. Watch out for the big junkyard dog who protects the property next door. Whatever those special instructions might be, you might put those into this section of your tab. Okay. And then what about your vital records? What vital records will you need? Do you have reports that you have to do periodically? And again, you might, in the writing of your continuity of operations plan, you may have someone that you have to do reporting to, say every 30 days. We have to report on this many yada yadas. I would contact that agency and talk to them about, I'm doing a continuity of operations plan, and I am trying to determine whether or not this report would be considered an essential function. Would you forego the need for us to do this particular operation or this particular report if we were in the middle of a large earthquake? And sometimes you'll find that some of those things that you think are critical or essential, they're going to let you forego them during a disaster. Okay. What kind of resources are you going to need? What kind of vendors or contacts will you have to have? So when we talk about vital, vital records, did I miss? I must have missed continuity communications. We'll go back to that in just a minute. When you talk about vital records, what are the vital records? Always have what essential function are they associated with in your plan, so that if that essential function gets taken over by another agency, or you decided that it's not as essential as you thought it was, maybe you don't need this particular set of vital records either. So making sure that you always tie whatever it is back to those essential functions in your spreadsheet. How do you get to those vital records or those systems? How do you, if you had to go manually with those vital records, how would you do that? How would you then put them back in? You have to have some kind of a policy that says we're going to put our manual record information back into our systems within 90 days, or whatever your policy might be. How are they protected? And in this particular example, for HR records, in the comments we wrote, if staff is hired during the disaster, keep all files manually in a locked cabinet. We still want to make sure that we've protected people's personal information, even though we're in the middle of a disaster. So make sure that those social security numbers and things like that are still locked up, and people are still protected. Their information is protected. There are lots of bad guys out there that take an opportunity like a disaster to hurt people. So keep that in mind as you go through this process. Alternate communications, we did pass alternate communications tab, and there is a tab for that. And it's as simple as we're talking about communications devices, not necessarily the message. What device are we going to use? We use cell phones regularly. We use this particular provider, and we use the services from this provider for our cell phones, for our internet, for our email, for our texts. If we can't use this one, you know, we have some charging stations that we can use. We have some other things. If we can't use Verizon, who are we going to use? Well, we don't have a backup. If you don't have a backup, write in the plan that you don't have a backup. Might be something that management may want to look at in the future and help you to determine how to get around that. What would be your alternate means of communicating if you couldn't use your cell phones? Do you have radios? Do you have runners? Do you have other ways to communicate? So that might be something you may need to look at in the future. And now I'm just kind of jumping around, and I apologize for that. But we didn't talk about vendors, and we do need to make sure that if we've got vendors that we depend on to get our essential functions accomplished, that we've got them locked into our continuity of operations plan as well. That we've listed who they are, because remember, we may not be, I may not be the person doing that essential function. If I'm out of town and I have to give that function off to someone else, they may not know who the vendor is. So let's keep that information in our continuity of operations plan. And what activity is it attached to? What essential function needs these vendors? And then what's, you know, are they available during a COOP activation? Do they have a continuity of operations plan themselves? And if we can't use that vendor, do we have a backup vendor that we can use? And if our backup vendor isn't available, do we have another means of like in this case, you know, getting paper for our paper manual processes? Do we have notes and comments that lead us to another solution? So those are all of the tabs in the workbook. And like I said, if you complete this workbook, you essentially have all of the critical information that you need for a continuity of operations plan. I would say to you, if you had this workbook completed and you trained your staff to use this workbook, you'd almost have a continuity of operations plan. Okay, so what are the wraparound procedures? Those are the things that we need to write into our plan that are not in our workbook. Devolution is critical. What if no one in our agency can do those essential functions? Do we have a sister agency that could take over the feeding of this client base, or whatever the essential function is that needs to be accomplished? Can someone else do it? Can local government take over that function? Is there a sister organization that can take over that function? Do we have another department that could take over that function, or another location that could take over that function? And then once the all clear has been sounded, how do we bring this thing back to normal? How do we get back to whatever normal is, or whatever the new normal is? How do we reconstitute? Keeping in mind that whole process that we went through before. And then how do we test, train, and exercise? And how often do we test, train, and exercise? My recommendation for continuity of operations plans is that you put your eyes on it at least once a year, and you train staff at least once a year. Turnover is so high, especially in Silicon Valley. We have new staff coming on every day. And those folks, when they come on board, if their title is written into the continuity of operations plan, one of the things that you need to do for them very soon, as soon as you hire them, is help them recognize what their responsibility will be in a disaster, and the fact that they have a responsibility in the continuity of operations plan.
Cindy, this is Marcia. There are a couple of things in the chat.
Yes, go ahead.
From Lars Eric, speaking as a former room parent. This paper example reminds me that school teachers are often working under a sort of state of COOP. Yep, for supplies at least.
Yeah.
And then Richard Cox Mania said, should we include all business partners beyond vendors, like funders of government agencies?
Are they part of your essential functions? Then yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions, thoughts, concerns at this point? Okay. I want to go through the COOP process just so that we can remind ourselves of how and when we use those different elements of our COOP. So this is a refresher. If you were with us last week, we went through this in a little more detail. I'm going to go a little faster through it this time, so that just to remind you of what that process looks like, okay? Bang happens. Doesn't matter what bang is, doesn't matter what the dragon is that's come around the corner and into the village square. It's a disaster of some kind. It could be a power outage, it could be a flood, it could be an earthquake, it could impact only your office, it could impact the whole region. Doesn't matter. The first thing you do is not COOP. The first thing you do is your emergency procedures, whatever they are: duck cover and hold, evacuate the building. Whatever your emergency procedures are, that's the first thing you do when bang happens, okay? After that, you assemble using your delegation of authority and your orders of succession. You look around, you go, who's here, who's not in Tahiti? Let's put a COOP activation team together. The COOP activation team's purpose is to make sure that the COOP plan gets followed, and that any of those essential functions that have gaps, they can turn to the COOP activation team to help them resolve those gaps. Okay. The COOP activation team is going to decide whether or not the COOP gets activated. Okay. What is the situation? Do we need to activate the COOP? make that decision, that team makes that decision. If the answer is no, then go back to your normal day-to-day operations, or, if you can't use that floor, the elevator's not working, whatever the modified operations are. Okay. If the answer is yes, then we move on to activating our COOP. Yes, we're going to activate our COOP. At this point, we stop doing anything that is not an essential function. You may have people just standing around, right? People who aren't involved in essential functions. They could be used in this situation to respond to the disaster, to help someone who's injured, to help evacuate the building, to help with an essential function that that is not their day-to-day job. So you only start doing the essential functions at this point, nothing else, okay? We're down to essential functions. That's the reason that we've activated our COOP, okay? Then we start looking at some of those questions, and the COOP activation team should be looking at to each of those function responsible staff and say, do you have enough staff? If you don't, we've got a few people over here that maybe you could teach to do a piece of that function. If the answer is no, then we call for additional staff. Maybe you have to call another agency and ask them if they've got staff that could help with this function. Maybe you have to call in people who have retired, or people who have who don't typically do this function, but work for the agency. Maybe you need to call some of them in. If the answer is yes, we have adequate staff, then we start looking at our facility. Is our facility adequate? Do we have enough space to be able to do those essential functions? If no, then we relocate. We move to our alternate facility. We look in our plan and see what that address is and how to get into that building. If the answer is yes, then we move on and take a look at our communications. Are the communications adequate? If our communications are not adequate, then we look to our continuity communications, part of our COOP plan, and figure out what our alternate communications are. Okay. If the answer is yes, then we look at our records. Can we access our records? Do we have adequate access to our systems, do we have adequate access to our vendors? If the answer is no, then we go to our backup systems. We go to our backup procedures. If the answer is yes, then we've completed the process for getting those essential functions up and running, and we hopefully have everything going at this point. Now, someone asked last week, do these have to be done in this order? And the answer is no. They can be done in any order that makes sense to your essential functions. If it makes more sense, or to the disaster even, if it makes more sense to look at your facilities before you look at your staff, then go right ahead and move those boxes around. But those are the essential things that you're going to need to take a look at in order to get those essential functions up and running. Do we have a building? Do we have communications? Do we have our records? Do we have our staff? Okay. Once we've got that stuff all going, we should be able to do that within 12 hours is what they tell us. We should be able to get those essential functions, those things that are written into our plan that we have decided on a blue sky day are essential. We should be able to get them up and running within 12 hours. How long do we have to keep those things up and running? Until the incident is over, or 30 days and our management team has come up with a longer term plan. It might be 32 days. It might be 40 days. Our management team might need only 20 days. Whatever the gap is between those two is what we use our continuity of operations plan for. What happens if no one can do anything? We take that opportunity to consider devolution, to consider sister agencies, the city, the county, whatever, someone else to do those essential functions. Once the incident has been resolved or our 30 days and long-term plan have been established, then we need to figure out how to bring things back to some semblance of normal. How do we reconstitute? And those are just a reverse engineering of activating the COOP, right? We bring back those primary those primary vital records and those systems so that we can start putting things back into those. We bring back those primary facilities and those communications. We restore our staff back to normal. We bring everyone back. We start doing all those things that are not essential functions again. We start taking out the trash. We assume the normal operations, whatever it is, back in our regular building. Or if we have to assume operations in a modified way, our management team has told us what that modified way is, and we assume a modified operation. Okay? All right, now, questions. We know why we have to have a COOP. We know what a COOP is. We know what we need to support those essential functions. We know who's going to do it. Now we better do some of these other things. Now we better make sure that everyone knows the plan. This is not a secret plan. Everyone in your organization, whether it's essential or not, whether they are part of the essential functions or not, they need to know what the plan is. They need to know, even if they're non-essential, they need to know what they need to do if we activate the COOP plan. Should I hang out and wait to be part of someone else's essential functions? Is it my responsibility to, or should I just go home? Now, I will tell you that in a disaster, if a big earthquake has happened, your staff is going to want to go home and make sure their families are okay, or want to check in and make sure their families are okay. And this is where it's important that they have ahead of time a procedure that they can follow for themselves and their families. How are we going to do that? Especially if they're written into the continuity of operations plan, and maybe assisting them with at least information about how to prepare themselves and their families in case of a disaster. I know when I was working as an emergency manager, my family was very clear that if a large earthquake was to happen, I'm not going to be available. I'm going to be in the emergency operations center doing something that involves the entire county. I am not going to be available to help my family evacuate the house or whatever. So we had it written down. Where would the rest of my family members come together? Whose house would they go to? Who would they call? Where were the supplies? We had our family emergency plan all put in place so that we could do our essential functions, or I could go and do what I needed to do. Okay. We need to maintain a priority contact list. Those people who are written in by title, they've got to have a name and a contact number attached to them, but that should be a separate contact list, not necessarily their name and their phone number written into the plan itself. A separate contact list should be kept so that you can contact people. Let's say the disaster is in the middle of the night and you need them to come in. You need to be able to contact them. That's why it's so important that HR has current information about staff's phone numbers and how to contact them in a disaster. And then cross-train. I can't say that enough. Make sure that lots of people know how to get your essential functions done. The more the merrier. The more people know how to do it, the better the chance that you'll be able to be successful in accomplishing keeping your essential functions going. Check with your vendors. Make sure that they have some kind of resiliency plan written that they know what they're going to do in a disaster, and that you know whether or not they're going to be available. Cache some supplies, put, if you need a box with paper and forms and pens and whatever, and in your alternate facility, ask those folks if they've got a closet or a place where you can put those essential things, and you be able to access them if you were to use that facility as an alternate facility. And then write a manual for each of those essential functions. Write down what the procedures are, so that if it does come down that it's not the person that does those functions every day, they don't skip something and they don't forget something. So make sure that you've got those essential functions written down and those procedures, and they don't have to be part of your COOP. They could be set in another place. You could put those with the same place where you put your priority contact list. Having a binder or a place where you keep your plan, maybe even a couple of places where you keep your emergency operations plan, your priority contact lists, your procedures, your, those critical things for your agency, near the exit door of your building, in the trunk of the executive director's car, whatever, is going to make it easier for you when the disaster comes to be able to pull those things out and use them. It's not a good time when the earthquake has happened to make sure that the person closest to the front door stops and picks up all the binders that, have it all set up in one thing, in one box or one, so that you can pick it up and take it out quickly and use it in whatever capacity. Okay. All right. So that is continuity of operations planning. That is the procedure, the workbook, how to use the workbook, what to do with decisions that you have to make. On a blue sky day, I would say to you, from here, take the workbook that you've got and go back to your agencies and start looking at what the essential functions are. Get to that place and you'll be in pretty good shape. Okay. All right, so my timing is a little off. I've gotten through this a lot faster. I got a little nervous when they told me that we only had one interpreter and I only had an hour. So if we have any questions, if we have any thoughts, if we have any concerns, if you want to just tell me about essential functions that you have come up with and you want to talk about how to move forward in your continuity of operations plan. Anybody decide after listening for the last 2 sessions that your agency doesn't need a continuity of operations plan? Y'all think you do? We talked to libraries when I was doing this with the county. We talked to the director of county libraries, and she said, I don't think we have a continuity of operations plan. Our payroll is done by HR. Our department doesn't have day-to-day essential functions. We do have emergency response that we need to accomplish, but continuity of operations is not necessarily something we need to do. So they did not write a continuity of operations plan after going through this process. For that very reason, they just could not come up with functions that they felt would be essential enough to be considered part of a continuity of operations plan. They do have an emergency response plan. They do know that they set up warming centers and cooling centers during extreme weather events. They do stand up a mobile book. The mobile book vans, they send them to shelters during sheltering situations where people can use books, in those situations, but they don't have a continuity of operations plan. So looking at the chat, let's see, what do we got here?
This is Marcia. Tony is asking more about a case study for faith organizations. I think we might be able to talk about their essential functions for a minute.
Sure. Let's take a look at faith organizations and the essential functions. Now, I think this is, in my personal opinion, one of the most difficult things to do, to separate what it is that I do in response to the disaster versus what it is that I do as an essential function. So Tony, you want to come off of mute and talk a little bit more about what your day-to-day functions would be?
Sure, be glad to. So in general, faith-based organizations, in theory, you probably could say if you shut down operations for 2 months, nothing terrible happens unless you're operating a homeless shelter or you're actually feeding, you're providing your food service to people who don't have any other means. But I think listening to you has been very interesting because there are simply some operations that you have to continue running, like you've got to manage payroll, because if even in a disaster, if you don't have access to their paycheck, they may be in serious trouble. So I suppose that could be considered an essential function. Another essential function will be making sure the facility stays in good shape. If there's a natural disaster, earthquake, etc. I know that's not continued operation, but you have to make sure at least that the facility stays heated if you've got frost, etc., and you continue paying utility bills. I can't think of other essential functions though for a normal faith-based facility.
Yeah, and so one of the points that you brought up is whether or not your essential functions support others' essential functions. So if one of your tasks is to feed a client base of some kind, and you do that on a daily basis, or you do that every week or whatever, maybe essential functions might be what it is that supports that function. So if you need to keep the water on, if you need to keep power going, if you need to keep people paid and in the capacity of being able to pass that food out, that might be those supportive functions for other essential functions. Heather, did you have something you wanted to say?
Heather does, as this faith-based specialist for SF Cardin, who used to be an Episcopal minister before I caught the disaster bug. The spiritual care for your congregation, I'm making an assumption here by using the word congregation, I apologize, but the spiritual care that is provided both by your leadership and by membership for each other is an essential function. Absolutely. It can be easy to say, oh, we don't need to, but I mean, just think about during COVID, how hard we all struggled and in some cases filed lawsuits to make sure that we could continue to provide spiritual care in a way that felt meaningful. It absolutely is worthy of thinking about in terms of your continuity of operations, not just your emergency response. forgive me for saying so. Food banks are important. I don't disagree, but at the end of the day, the reason that we have come together as a faith community isn't actually to keep a food bank open, as opposed to say the San Francisco Marin Food Bank. Like, their purpose is to keep a food bank open, but your first mission statement should also be reflected in your disaster mission statement. The reason that you organized in the first place is in fact the most important thing in a disaster to make sure it keeps going. I'll climb down off my hobby horse now.
Well,
Thank you, Heather, for stating the obvious that I overlooked. Thank you very much.
and Lars also almost echoed that in counseling and support, those kind of services would be considered essential functions in your situation, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure. Somebody else want to talk about their agency, and maybe we can bat around what your essential functions might be? Anybody have questions about what they might consider their essential functions? I know I had someone, and I don't mean to call you out. If I do, I apologize. But someone had contacted me about the fact that they were a small child care facility. And I thought it was kind of interesting to think about, they asked whether or not this training would be useful for a small agency like a small child care agency. And it's okay if you don't want to speak up or if you're not on the line, but let's take that one as a case study just quickly. You have a small child care agency in your home, maybe even. Essential functions, what kind of essential functions would you have? Anybody?
This is Marcia. You'd have to keep it safe. So
Would you consider in a child care facility, would you consider if you had a child care business in your home, would you consider that child care business an essential function? Or would you not do childcare in an earthquake?
I think you can certainly make that choice. If you are concerned about the people that you're the families themselves, if the families are first responders and they need to go do their job, then you might choose that as an essential function to that you're supporting their essential function.
Exactly, a supporting essential function. And then again, the earthquake may not happen when the kids are at home, but rather when they're in your facility. And so then it's a matter of, you have to take into consideration some of those issues, like the safety of your facility, reunifying those children with their parents. Lars has brought those issues up in the chat, and making sure that you can keep those children safe while you're waiting for them to be reunified with their parents. So those, and then going from there, I would say, then you need to take a look at what is it that you need to do in order to keep that childcare facility up and running. How do you?
Lars has his hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Lars.
Thanks. No worry. A lot of what I was going to say, you kind of already said, actually. But besides the example of reunification, which is a big issue for anybody, I mean, I first heard it brought up for schools. Like, you can't just release the children to anybody. So a lot of schools have had to have plans of what happens if we're basically having to take care of the children for extended period of time because the people we're supposed to release them to can't make it to the school or can't make it to the childcare center. And I've done trainings in the past for agencies like Bananas and 4Cs, and that's exactly the kind of issue they have, talking about we may have to take care of these kids for an extended period of time until their parents or caregivers are able to get to us. This also ties an example you talked about earlier about making sure that your family is taken care of. A school principal for a small Berkeley school I talked 2 years ago actually taught in ran the school in Berkeley, but lived in San Francisco. And her mother was highly mobility impaired. And she'd remembered from Loma Prieta, getting back to San Francisco, not likely. So she made sure that she built up lots of relationships with neighbors and friends on that side of the bay to know that her mom was going to be taken care of, because she wasn't going to be able to get back over there even if she wanted to or could. Plus she had very young children, preschool and elementary school age that she'd be responsible for. So factors like that, yeah, it's, and then COVID. I mean, look how essential childcare was for the first months of COVID.
Absolutely. Yeah, and boy, COVID sure has given us the ability to take a look at what we're calling disasters too, isn't it? We used to always talk about most disasters are fairly similar. Something happens, it impedes whatever, and we respond how we do. But we bring everyone together, or we evacuate the building or whatever. But COVID is so opposite many of the other disaster responses, because we have to separate, we have to be on our own. Everyone has, we can't come together. So how do we accomplish essential functions? We can't come together, Thank goodness we had Zoom, because, how would agencies have been able to keep essential functions going without things like Zoom? The Disneyland of disasters added a new ride. I used to have a slide that I used to show that said California is the disaster capital of the world, or the disaster theme park of the world. And I had all kinds of little rides that were just disaster rides. Yeah. Okay.
This is Marcia. I'm thinking back to the faith plan again, because I'm trying to think, okay, so what do I put in that plan then? I put in payroll. I put in ensuring the facility doesn't deteriorate during the event, and I put in faith, maintaining the emotional spiritual care function. So if their staff was not available, then that would be developing relationships with similar organizations so that you could call on them. And it might be, well, I guess part of the emergency response, I still get these confused all the time, would be checking in with your congregation. But then when you identified people that had needs, that's definitely an essential function.
Dean says, what might an MOU look like for a small child care facility with an organization like YMCA or a city shelter? Yeah, and we do have some MOU templates that we could share with you. But I would say to you, yes, absolutely. Taking a look at putting together some kind of an MOU, something in writing that just says, here's how we're going to do this. If we can't keep our childcare facility up and running, here's what we're going to do, and here's who we're going to do it with, and here's how we're going to get that done, and here's how long we're going to do it for. Is it a situation in your childcare facility that your facility isn't available and you need to move to another location, but you have staff, and maybe your MOU is just asking the YMCA for space so that you can keep your childcare or your childcare business going in another location. Your staff comes with you and they still do the care of the children. Maybe that's the situation, and you write those kind of things into your MOU. I would certainly say to you that, you both parties need to be in agreement with, and just sit down and say, start the sentence with what if, fill in the blank, and come up with the conclusions that you write into your MOU and both parties sign, and there you are.
And this is Marcia again. So that the MOUs, I know everyone struggles with that, but if you have any kind of an existing agreement with someone that's already been written by an attorney, you just have to save the parts that hold harmless. And when it can be, how long it will remain in effect. But you could look through, and I used to do this, and I identify the legalese that's not going to change. And then you started out with that this is agreement between this organization and this organization, and briefly describe what they do. And then say, in an event of a disaster, your role is to do XYZ, which could be the essential functions, or it could be more. And their role is whatever it is. And then say, during the disaster, you agree that, how one organization is going to help the other. And then just double check your insurance. Like if you were using their facility, make sure your insurance is okay with you using their facility under your insurance, or if that has to be under their insurance. And then that just needs to be called out. Who's responsible if someone gets injured, those kind of things. So it's really just thinking through how it would look operationally, and making sure that anything that is not obvious gets put into the agreement. So we could help talk you through that. And we do have samples of really basic forms. Once you have one reviewed by an attorney, and they're for your organization, and they're comfortable with the legal part, the agreement piece is really easy, and you could just use the same template for more than one MOU.
That's good information, Marcia. Thank you for sharing. And then Lars also talked about, I knew a small school that served children with developmental disabilities that had an MOU with a nearby public school. Should they have to evacuate? Fairly straightforward agreement. It did include accommodations that might be needed. So that's if you run a developmental disabilities childcare facility, making sure that you have some of those things to be able to accommodate your client base is going to be critical, and written into your continuity of operations plan as a continuity facilities and such. So yeah, absolutely. All right.
Yeah, what else? Is there a critical or an essential function that you aren't sure how to solve the essential function, how you're going to be able to continue it if you're missing staff?
I always find the missing staff piece pretty interesting, because sometimes I see agencies write essential functions list. Now, it would never be any of you, I'm sure, that are really long and really extensive. And there's lots of things that they think are essential. And then when the disaster comes and the earthquake has happened and they're looking around and the building is in shambles, then they don't want to do any of those things. And they go, oh, these were not as essential as we thought they were. Put yourself in the position of what it would be like trying to accomplish this function. And what's the fallout if I don't accomplish this function in a major earthquake? Is it really an essential function? I would say to you, the fewer essential functions you have, the better off you are. However, making sure that you have a complete list of essential functions is also critical. But if it's questionable, let's really look at, is it essential? Do we have to do this? Because you might only have staff to do your top 3 functions. You might only have staff to do one thing. You might not have any staff, and you might have all your essential functions that you have to give over to someone else to do. Are they going to be able to do all 45 essential functions that you've got on your list?
And this is Marcia again, and then I think it comes down to then what's the fallout? Which one has the greatest fallout? And if it's just a compliance issue, then you may be able to get a waiver or something, because organizations aren't trying to make your life more miserable if you've been through a disaster. We had this conversation one time with the food bank about what is your essential function. It's delivering food. Well, what if you don't have enough people to deliver food? And then what's the most essential function? So delivering food is one thing, but then what if you could only give out one thing because you didn't have enough staff? What is the one thing that would be most important to give people?
Or does that function have to be broken into, we deliver food to this location as our number 1 priority, and this location as our number 2 priority? And if you only have enough food to give food out to the priority 1 location, and what does the priority 2 location do for food? You know, those kind of questions are very unique to that particular agency, but you might find that your agency has similar questions.
Well, and I would just say that if you could only deliver one commodity, it would be water. And you could go a whole week delivering water and then start delivering food as you were able to find more staff.
I could go for a long time just with the snack bars that I have in the drawer of my desk.
Yeah. Well, then we're back to preparedness, aren't we?
That's true.
It's a circle.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions, concerns? All right. We get paid from grant funding, and this is how we provide free trainings to you. The requirement for that grant funding is that we provide them with a survey. The survey is going to pop up when we finish today. I'm just reading Lars's comment in the chat, sorry. Besides staffing, some agencies I've worked with were concerned about alternate communications should their primary go down. Yeah, absolutely.
I just noted that some of them had a hard time thinking of what they could do for alternate. So I don't know if anybody wanted to explore that anymore or not.
That's a good one.
Go ahead, start us off, Lars, and we'll do the survey after. The survey stuff.
Well, to give one interesting and slightly weird example, there was a set of law offices in downtown Oakland that tested using walkie-talkies. And they found that because most of their offices were more or less line of sight, the walkie-talkie, and they were not too far from each other, the walkie-talkies worked out pretty well. And then you actually had guys who had the delightfully mentioned runners, because I know that one housing agency that's not far from the Hayward Fault, they have many locations that are kind of widespread, but not like, you know, other ends of the county. They're all in South County. So their emergency supply sheds, besides water, food, first aid kits, lights, blankets, also had bicycles. The idea being that they were expecting road conditions to be really bad, not drivable, but a bicycle can sometimes be like lifted over that big crevasse that opened up on the road. So these are like 2 examples of thinking outside the box. I don't know if anybody has other examples or thoughts. It's just mentioning.
No, this is Marcia. Yes, absolutely. And ham radio. It's not that hard to get a license now, and you can work with your local jurisdiction. They have ham radio groups that are part of the disaster response, and they could help you identify what you would need in order to be effective for whatever area you have to cover. And back to the bicycles, there's a bicycle club in San Jose, and I've talked to them about being runners or bikers to pass information. They passed food during COVID. They delivered meals. So there are all kinds of resources in our community, as long as they can do it safely, because we're not going to put anyone else in harm's way.
Hey, Marsha, what were you talking to the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and we actually also deliver food even during non-COVID times in East San Jose to needy families.
That's amazing.
So one of your essential functions is going to have to be keeping those bicycles up.
That's right.
And this is Lynn. If I could jump in just to piggyback on something Marsha said about amateur radio. Is a great communication means. You might survey your employees and workers and see if anyone has an amateur radio license. They may already have it, or you might want to look at getting that. It's not that hard to get your license. And it's an excellent means of communication. Communicate with the city. Most cities have an amateur radio group, and it's a really good way to do it.
Yeah, and then I would also add, I'm sure most of you have already heard this, but if your cell phone is not working as a phone, sometimes it's easier to text. So making sure that you've got some group texts abilities so that you can use your phone in a texting capacity is also another way of doing alternate communications rather than trying to talk on the phone, texting each other. And when would you do that and how would you do that? All stuff that you could practice or test during your exercises of your plan.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment also about the amateur radio. You know, there are all these amateur radio emergency service groups that Marsha mentioned. San Jose, Cupertino, Sunnyvale, etc. have them all, and they are linked to the Office of Emergency Services. And there is a way, if you can't reach 911, that if you talk to an amateur radio person who's part of these groups, they can actually get to 911. And those there are packet systems that allow for written communications. So it's quite an extensive network that nonprofits could also tap into.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And we can get you, if anyone wants information, we can get information on that. We are considering bringing the ham radio licensing class here. It's a one-day class, depending on the interest of our partners.
Great information. Thanks everyone for sharing. Okay, back to that survey thing. So the survey is going to pop up at the end of the meeting. We'll leave this channel open for a little while to give you an opportunity to fill out the survey. It's not terribly long or arduous, but it certainly is important to us and to you indirectly, because again, this is how we fund our classes. So.
And if you filled it out last week, because I think 11 or 12 of you did, you don't have to do it again.
That's true. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for filling out the survey if you've already done so. All right. So any questions about cadre? Any questions about continuity of operations?
Tony, I don't think I posted the video. I should have, but I don't think I did. I will post last week's video and get today's up faster than that.
Thanks, Marsha. Appreciate that.
And I'll pull out one of my old MOUs and I'll just take out I'll just leave in the legalese part, and you can see it could be really easy. Your attorney may want to add things, but you could, at least it's a start.
Right. I gift you the gift of almost 30 minutes.
Hey.
Or if you are finished, if this is all we have, I would say to you, thank you so much. This has been to be able to walk through continuity of operations planning with you. If in the future you have questions individually, please feel free to contact me directly. or to contact Cadre at admin@cadresv.org. We have other classes coming up, and we'll be putting those out as they become available. There is another opportunity to do and a more abbreviated version of continuity of operations planning coming up in the future. It's called COOP 101. It's for agencies who have never done a COOP before, or who have not participated with Cadre in the past. Not necessarily a requirement, but certainly it will be a more abbreviated version of this class. If you have people that you would like to attend and listen in on that session as well, we'll let you know when that session is coming up. But it's, I believe, coming up in April. So with that, I thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day, and get out there and get some sunshine.